This one's going to be a tearjerker a little bit. I know Mr. Young was talking about it being so, but we're going to have fun with it at least. But the man we're going to be talking about was a American professional wrestler, and not only known for the longevity of his career, which spanned more than 50 years, including a couple short-lived retirements. That's been a running joke. He was a former NWA world champ, influential in hardcore style wrestling. That was part of his later part of the career, and certainly considered one of the best at his craft. Also was involved in Hollywood, some TV, movies. We'll get into all that. But yes, we're talking Terry Funk. And with us today is Mr. Brian Young from the Transatlantic Historical Podcast. Brian, how are you?
I am fantastic today, and thank you so much for bringing me on to pay tribute to someone who was actually a very dear, close friend of mine, as well as being an icon and a legend, the great Terry Funk.
Yes, and the other gentleman joining us from, you've heard him before with his association with Detroit Wrestling, and he's been an announcer and done so much on his own and had interactions with Mr. Funk as well, Mr. Terry Sullivan. Terry, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. And I'm so glad that Brian is on, because he had that personal relationship, whereas, I was around Terry a lot, but I can't ever say that we actually ever sat down and had a heart-to-heart talk.
And it's nice because last time I think I saw Terry was 2014, 2015, but I knew him in the early 2000s working for like 3PW and a couple other spots in Philadelphia doing the indie shots. So it wasn't true heart-to-hearts, but he was a guy, and I think you both can testify that Terry was, whenever he got talking, he was a guy you'd want to sit under the learning tree.
Oh, Terry was, there are certain people that, it's a weird phrase that they'll use, is that they know who they are. And when someone knows who they are, they can just hold a group of people at attention like a Zen master. My mentor in writing was the legendary Bert Sugar, the boxing journalist and writer, and another dear friend of mine. And he had that ability that if there was a room and there were people in it and Bert was one of them, there would be a semicircle around Bert listening to stories. And I would ask Bert, how do you do it? He goes, because I know who I am. Howard Cosell was the same way, and was famous for saying, I know who I am. Terry would never say that because he was a little more humble than those guys, but Terry knew who he was. And he was the Zen master for anybody he was around in that business.
Exactly. And obviously, and we'll get into it, but I obviously know, as Brian knows, some of my relationships from the acting world, and they got to work. I'll put it this way. I guess when we get there, I'll tell the story again. But Terry, at least 2 out of 3 of the parties who worked with Terry on that particular film will confirm publicly with a wink and a nod this Terry story. But the other one, I give her credit. She has no idea what I'm talking about. And I wasn't in the room. I'll put it that way. So I'll start with Brian because we were just joking about it as we were getting here.
Well, no, before we do that, welcome Terry Sullivan to the show.
We did. But I just introduced Terry.
Yeah, but you let me talk first. So I want Terry to talk because he's from Detroit and I'm from Buffalo, and Detroit people can kick Buffalo people's asses.
Especially in hockey, but that's a whole nother thing.
Oh. You mean I have to put you over again?
That's right.
Jeez, oh, peace, man. Just to follow up on what Brian said, I can absolutely attest to the fact that when I knew Terry in wrestling in Detroit, it was about 1978, and he had been the NWA World Heavyweight Champion and had achieved so much by that time that when he walked into the dressing room, I mean, a lot of the wrestlers were really in awe of him. And I think many, myself included, were hesitant to even approach him. But when you did, and hey, come on, he'd talk to you like he'd known you his entire life. And certainly he backed up as you know who you are, and he backed that up in the ring every single night because he knew his profession, he knew the people, he knew his opponent, and he knew what he needed to do to make the best possible impression on that night.
Yeah. Wrestling related, we'll start with Terry, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And obviously, I was listening to different tributes and everything else going on. And I happened to come across not only Mr. Young's on his gimmick, but I was also listening to Mr. Brian Sullivan's, who wrote the book on the Sheik. And the Sheik had a unique, he had a unique relationship being with Detroit Wrestling and Amarillo. What do you know on that, Terry?
I really don't know anything specifically about that. I know Brian Solomon has done a lot of stuff. He's been a lot of places, worked for the mags, one thing or another. As far as a specific association with Detroit, this is the first I'm hearing of it.
Oh, no, I think he meant the Sheik's relation with Amarillo.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, gosh, I'm so sorry.
Yes.
The Sheik, in his very early days, he worked in Texas. In fact, I think they lived there for a while. He and his wife Joyce, who accompanied him to the ring as the princess. And the Sheik worked with Dory Sr. and really, they had that territory on fire. And a lot of other people were also there at the same time. But the Sheik worked a lot of main events, not just in Amarillo, but around the entire territory. And I was in the office, the Sheik's office in Michigan, the day that he came in and told us that Dory Sr. had died. And he was visibly affected by it.
Yeah, exactly. Because for those who don't know, I guess we could tell the story of Dory Sr.'s passing, but the way Terry would tell it in his fabulous book, which is up on the shelf here, signed, thank you, Mr. Funk. But some of the boys were hanging out at the house or the ranch or wherever they were, and there may have been some beverages indulged on, and of course, Dory Sr. got into the action, wrestling around with some of the boys and whatnot. Went out for a breather. Says to the boys, "Not bad for an old man, huh?" Went out for a breath of fresh air and ended up telling Vicky, Terry's wife, that, hey, I think I'm having a heart attack, which ended up being the case. And, went to the hospital and tried to get him help, but didn't make it to the second hospital. So.
Yeah. And, that kind of just shows you how tough those old, are we going for like G rating here, or can I say sons of bitches?
You could say whatever you guys want.
Those tough old sons of bitches. No, Dory Sr. was a legitimate badass, a pure shooter and a great wrestler. Light heavyweight champion of the world and just dominating physical specimen. It's funny. A lot of people say so much of Dory Sr. went into his boys in different ways. Dory had his skill as a wrestler, and Terry had his absolute toughness
and personality, from what I heard.
Yeah. Luckily, Terry did not have the hairline of his brother and father. But, Dory Sr., wrestling around with guys half his age, and apparently having the better of them in that altercation that gave him the heart attack. But is there a better way to go out for someone like Dory Sr. than that?
Absolutely not.
No. So, Brian, with you, what was your first interaction with Terry? Because I mentioned this story earlier before we hit record, but what was yours?
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up knowing Terry. When I was a kid, I loved Terry Funk. I always tended to like heels. And Terry was
He's a heel, damn it.
yeah, and he was such a madman, and I just loved him. But many years ago when I started researching the book that I did, Wrestlers, Masters of the Craft of Professional Wrestling, available on Amazon.com and book locations worldwide.
ECW Press, I believe, too.
ECW Press, yes, with Dan Murphy, co-wrote. So we were looking for people to interview because the book was to be an oral history, and it was to be written by all the boys, anybody involved in the business, through interviews and recordings. And I was searching people to talk to, and one of the ones I really wanted to talk to was Terry Funk. And I couldn't track him down. So I started doing some investigation work, and I'm like, well, I know he lives in Texas, and how many Funks are there in Texas? And I know where the Double Cross Ranch is, and I know property's been up for sale in that area. I tracked him down that way. And I cold called him. I was on my lunch break at work. I called the number. And for those who didn't know Terry, especially in his older years, Terry always had that great voice. But as he got older, it got a little bit higher pitched. And you couldn't mistake that voice anywhere. So I cold dial this number, and I'm standing out in the courtyard of my work. And all of a sudden, I hear, hello? And instantly it's Terry Funk. And I'm like, hi, Mr. Funk. My name's Brian Young. I'm an author, and I'm working on this book on the history of the wrestling business. It's going to be an oral history. Give him the whole spiel, a nice little 5-minute spiel about who I am, the purpose of the book, why I want to talk to him. And the next thing he says is, I think you have the wrong number. Which obviously you don't, because it's so terrifying. I'm like, wrong number. Come on, you're Terry Funk. Yeah, I'm Terry Funk, but why do you need me to help you with a book? I'm stupid.
Man, that one sense of humor.
Yeah, and then we laughed about it, and he said, absolutely, call me back. I'm going to do my best not to do Terry's voice every time I talk about him, but it's very hard not to.
He's like Stu Hart and some of the other cast the characters in the business.
He's like
it's Dusty, hard not to.
He like Dusty Rhodes, baby. You can't do Dusty without talking like Dusty. Which remind me on that as soon as I'm done with this little anecdote.
God, I should have called Bruce Pritchard for the voice impressions too. But yeah.
So Terry says, "Yeah, you know what? Give me a call." This was on a Thursday afternoon. I first going. He said, "Why don't you call me Saturday, and I'll give you an interview." And when I called him that Saturday, it wasn't an interview. We talked for several hours. I mean, just several hours. And then he says, if you want more stories, you can call me back. I'll be around Monday. And I called him Monday. And we started calling each other back and forth, not just with stories, but because we had a similar sense of humor. We were having a good time. And Terry's health was starting to fail at that time. His physical health. And we talked about that. And I would call him up every once in a while to see how he was doing, see how he was feeling. And as the months rolled on, you could tell he was starting to slip in other ways in his mental capacity. And I reached out to his daughter, Brandy. And I told her who I was, because I didn't want her to think, if there is something wrong with the father, that the schmuck's trying to take advantage of him. So I wanted to call her and, explain who I was, why I was talking to him. And would you mind if I continued to talk to him? Because I wanted the family permission at that point. And she's like, no, that's fantastic. He loves talking about old times and having a good laugh. And it's really good therapy for people who are starting to have problems with dementia.
If I can interrupt you real quick with this story.
Yeah.
I think I should bring up too, because when I heard you tell the story on your tribute, you mentioned that there was a either mental health or assistant living help in your family as well,
yes.
Correct?
Well, that's how I could pick up on the very, very, very early signs of it.
That's why it's key for me to mention that, but go ahead.
Yeah, my extended family, especially my uncle, my aunts, my mother, and my younger brother, all worked in that field. Assisted living, people with dementia and Alzheimer's. My mother was the administrator of a facility for 20 years. My uncle owned several facilities. My younger brother graduated college at 21 years old and went right to work as a social worker for patients with dementia. So it's something I've been around my entire life, and I could pick up signals, because when it's really early onset, 90% of the people in the world wouldn't know, but I could pick up on signals. So that's when I talked to her, and she confirmed, yeah, it's just starting. Please go ahead and talk to them. And from that moment on, this is where I get choked up, actually. And, it's a slow process, the disease like that.
Mm-hmm.
But from that moment on until just a couple months before the end, I was on the phone with Terry 2 to 3 times a week, every week for several years, sometimes a few minutes at a time, sometimes several hours at a time. But I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of talking to him. And the only reason I didn't at the end is the very end, the last few months, his health conditions, both physical and mental, had caught up. He also was suffering with Parkinson's disease. And he had become essentially nonverbal. He couldn't even speak on the phone anymore. He couldn't talk. I would talk to him occasionally, even after that, like, when one of the daughters was going to see him, they would call me on their cell phone and put it up to him to talk to him a little bit. But we developed such a close bond over those several years that it, really hurt his passing.
Yeah.
He was such a great guy. But before we go on, I got to say this, because you were talking about, you have to do the voice when you talk about.
Is this the Dusty story?
It's, yeah.
Okay.
Terry loved Dusty. And, everybody knows, Dusty, you egg-sucking dog. And all the Dusty promos and bashing Dusty and the feuds with Dusty. Well, him and Dusty go way back to Amarillo, when Dusty went to, West Texas University. But Terry could not say Dusty's name without saying, and then Dusty, that fat bastard. I'm convinced Dusty Rhodes' middle name was that fat bastard. That's one time, Dusty, that fat bastard, and I were. But the funniest thing I ever heard in my life from any wrestler or anybody involved in wrestling was the time Terry was telling me a Dusty story, trying to do Dusty's voice. So there's Terry trying to talk like Dusty Rhodes with a bad list. It was hilarious. Oh, he was great. He loved Dusty, though, but Dusty, that fat bastard Rhodes, Terry loved.
It almost sounds like me in my household, that I think my middle name's asshole 9 times out of 10. But that's a whole nother story for another day. But the story, and we'll bounce around here a lot, guys, but you both being historians and experts in the field of wrestling, it's kicked around a lot of guys going to West Texas State. Obviously Dick Murdoch was known for just playing in the alumni game and such. The school's now West Texas A&M University. But did all the guys that they say went to that university at the time, obviously it was Blanchard and Tito Santana. I know Ted DiBiase went there, and did all those guys really go there because of the Funks, or was it they just so happened to go there and get connected with the Funks?
Terry told me, him and Junior both played football there.
Yes,
as you said, DiBiase played football there. I'm getting old.
We all are.
Yeah, you just named all these names: Tito Santana,
Bruiser Brody, and
Bruiser. Yeah, Frank Goodish, who played football there and ended up going to the NFL. A few other people that were drafted. Tito Santana was drafted to the NFL. Tully Blanchard, as Terry said, set records in West Texas: most interceptions, most sacks. He was the worst quarterback ever. I think what happened was, football players would go to West. Dusty went for baseball. He was not there for wrestling. or for football. A lot of guys would go to West Texas. They were tough. They were strong. And the coach was friends with Senior.
Oh.
And if they saw a kid with potential who's not going to go to the NFL, hey, here's the card of my friend Dory Funk Sr., why don't you talk to him? Or someone like Ted DiBiase, who was a second-generation wrestler.
Well, they all had a second-generation connection. Except
they
Tito.
all did, yeah. Tito did not. Goodish did not, I don't think.
Right.
But, Tully did. Obviously, Dory and Terry. So Murdoch, Hanson, I think, went there as well.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. If they weren't going to make the NFL, if they wouldn't have any prospects, you got a wrestling history. Why don't you go talk to Dory Sr.? He'll set you straight. He'll get you right. So it was a good place to go when you knew wrestling could be a backup, if you had the cojones, because you weren't getting through. It was like going to Vern Gagne school. You weren't getting through that training if you weren't tough.
Harry, want to get you involved more here. When was your first interaction with Terry? You were talking about, being nervous, and a lot of guys will be nervous in the locker room and such. But Terry Funk, I should say, would make you feel comfortable and tell stories and talk with you like he knew you forever. But when was since I asked Brian, when was your first interaction with Terry Funk?
Well, I'll tell you about my first personal interaction, but I knew of him the way a lot of us knew of him at that period of time through the wrestling magazines. And there was a lot of coverage from Texas, and partially one of the reasons might have been because of all the bloodshed in Texas. But
shocker.
He came in first, and I don't remember the exact year, it might have been 77. And a lot of people remember the preeminent tag team match of all time in Japan when Terry and Dory Jr. went up against the Sheik and Abdullah the Butcher. And it was a series, and I don't know if it was the greatest tag team bout of all time, certainly the bloodiest, and certainly did a lot of good business. Anyway, there were tapes of that, which the Sheik had. And when when he finally could arrange it, they wanted to recreate the tag team match in Detroit, which they did in various forms. I think the first time it was Dory and another partner. And then after that match, Dory said, I'm going to bring in my brother. Then Terry came in. But this was basically as a face. In 78, he came in as a heel against a face, Mark Lewin, whose role changed a year or so down the road too. But that's when I first met him in person, seeing him wrestle on television, interviewing him, and watching his matches, which were just amazing with Mark Lewin. Two of the greatest of all time right there. But yeah, that's my first interaction.
And you bring up
I got to interrupt because I love Terry Sullivan. He's a dear friend, but that's twice you managed to say the name Mark Lewin without saying Buffalo, New York's own Mark Lewin.
I apologize. I'll do my penance.
That's right.
Yeah. Father Bob, Father Neil. Oh, wait, that's a wrong joke for a different place. But yeah, we won't go there. But Terry brings up an interesting point there where Terry Funk or whatever would come in to different territory. And I should say Dory Sr. as well. When Dory Jr. was the NWA champion, the family would come in and kind of set the tone for when Jr. would come in as the champion. So I don't care who takes this, but how was that from what you guys know? Because obviously I've heard the stories, but how did that go and I know they did a similar thing with the Briscoes as well, Jack and Jerry, but with the Funks, how did that usually work when Terry and Dory Sr. would come in for ahead of the Junior? And you guys know where I'm going with that.
Well, in Detroit, it just started with Dorian, the tag team match against the Butcher and the Sheik. And at some point in time, we showed the Japan match on the television show. And there was the ending of the match with Dorian, a different partner, was inconclusive for some strange reason. And then Dory said, well, I really want to get this done. I'm going to bring in my brother, Terry. And that caused a lot of excitement.
Yeah. And you go back to when Dory Jr. was champ. A lot of times Terry would go into the town and, the kayfabe, I'm checking out the competition for my brother, the champion. And then, of course, that would be reversed several years later when Terry was champion. On my tribute to Terry, along with Terry Sullivan, we had Rodney West, who was the son of Ron West, the referee and matchmaker and booker in Georgia. And, Rodney had been around it his whole life. And Rodney said something that really stood out to me was that Terry Funk reached the pinnacle of the business when he became NWA champ, but his career really started and exploded when he lost that title. Because when he was no longer champ, he didn't need Dory to go into a territory first. He didn't need anything. Terry Funk was the story where he went, whether it was go to Memphis to challenge Lawler.
My eye.
My eye. It didn't matter. But where Terry Funk went, even in Detroit by 78, if Terry Funk showed up, it didn't matter if there was Dory around. If they were together, so be it. That's even better. You're getting a 2-for-1. But Terry exploded into this character that name alone, Terry Funk, and that reputation alone, and everybody in the country. Because, like you said, Terry would be on the cover of the magazines covered in blood. Terry would be on TV screaming, cutting those crazy promos. Everyone in the country, no matter the territory, would be asses in seats if Terry Funk came to town. And, he transcended the territory system. He essentially had the power and the reach of the quote unquote champion of the time. Without holding that belt, he didn't need it. You could make the argument, wow, when Flair was champ in 70, the late 70s, early 80s, that was the draw no matter where he went because he was the champ. Terry didn't need a belt. It was just, oh my God, Terry Funk's in town. We got to go see this. Honey, pack the car. We're going to see Terry Funk.
Yeah. And, that's interesting and both of you, I'd love to hear your response to this. The way you describe that, though, is with Terry, you never knew what he was going to say or do. Hell, a lot of times Terry didn't know what he was going to say or do. I say that with all respect, but
yeah, and
he made you believe in what he was doing.
Oh,
Terry Sullivan can attest that because there was definitely one time neither Terry in this conversation knew what he was going to say or do, and Terry got a little closer to Terry than he wanted to. You got to tell the story.
Well, it's what happens to you when you smart off or get smart with a wrestler like Terry Funk, who was out of his damn mind. And so this is when he was the villain, the bad guy, and it was probably about Lou, and I'm pretty sure it was. And he came out after his match, and he was all wound up and all hot and bothered about something. And so he came down to the ring, and as he went, he got to this part where he said, I am the best wrestler in the world. I know it. Everybody knows it. You know it. You tell those people that I'm the best wrestler in the world. And I said, I'll be happy to tell the people that you're one of the greatest of all time. Sure. No, I want you to tell them that I'm the best wrestler in the world. And I said, well, again, you are one of the best of all time. No doubt about it. I'm telling you, I want you to tell the people that I'm the best wrestler of all time. And I got this edge to my voice. And I said, I'm not going to say that. And that's the last thing I knew, because he hauled off and punched me in the jaw, knocked me down. And Brian, this is
that famous left hand.
I don't even remember. I didn't see it coming, whatever it was. And Brian, I forgot about this part. After I was down on the ground, he kicked me repeatedly.
And see, folks, it wasn't always scripted. There weren't people telling people what to say and do. These guys were so creative, they did it themselves.
And with that, I should bring up too, because Terry tells that story awesome. And he can laugh about it now, but I remember talking to Mick Foley, and he says I'm trying to think of the kid's name, or I shouldn't say kid, but the referee he was close with, that would come hang out at Danucci School and worked in WCW and such. But this gentleman would tell Mick, hey, you got to watch these matches, and it would be Brody and Funk on VHS from Japan and such. And Mick would always go, man, those left hands, because Terry Funk was left-handed, those punches are unbelievable. And wow, and this, that, and the other. I wonder how he does it. Well, fast forward a few years, Mick is in the ring with Terry. Well, he found out how Terry Funk did those punches. It was he hit you. There was no sugarcoat, nothing.
No, and I'm glad you brought up Terry and Brody and their feud in Japan, because Terry told me a story once about that, and this shows the level of professionalism and master of the craft, not to reference the book title, but that's why it's called that, the masters of the craft, the psychology of wrestling, the psychology of the show, is that these wrestlers nowadays, and all due respect to them as athletes, I mean, they are the most incredible athletes you'll ever see. As far as being physical specimens and athletes, they're probably better than any time in history. But you hear these stories about people saying, okay, well, we need this match to be 5 minutes and you go over. And the loser says, but how do I get my high spots in? And that's
sounds like today.
Yeah, that's about. All today is, where's my high spot? Where's my high spot? Where's my high spot? Terry told me the first match he had against Brody in Japan, Terry was already an established star in Japan, had been for years. Mm-hmm. And Terry was not just a star in Japan. Terry was fucking Elvis in Japan. I mean, Terry had albums in Japan, singing albums.
Oh, good.
So did Abby, but...
Yeah, people bought albums of Terry singing in Japan.
Do you have a rendition of that, Mr. Young?
No, because even I can't do that bad. But he was, Terry was like the Beatles. I mean, the paparazzi was everywhere. He couldn't go anywhere without the press being there and the fans following him. And go watch some of those Terry matches in Japan. Japanese audiences tend to be very reserved, very refined, very quiet, because that's the culture, and you applaud after something. Watch Terry's entrances in some of those matches in Japan. Those people are going ape shit.
How about new, you crazy Dutch bastard?
I mean, that's the effect he had. And he's going against this monster, Bruiser Brody, the first time. And Terry calls the match. I want you to get in the ring with that chain. You're going to beat the shit out of me from the opening bell. I'm not even going to get a lick in. I'm not going to have a comeback. You are just going to pound me, beat me. And even Brody's like, wait, you don't want any spots? You don't want anything? Nope. Because Terry knew that just made it a feud and bigger, and the public would care more about it. It didn't matter that he didn't get a high spot in. Those people were going to be bleeding for Terry, and they would do anything to see Terry get his revenge. And it would be a bigger deal. And then Terry, their hero, would come back from that. Nowadays, try to get a star, say, well, you're going to go on TV and get your ass handed to you without even getting any offense in. Do you think any of them would do it?
I can't think of many.
John Cena did it with Brock Lesnar. And my point was, I thought that was pretty much copied off of Funk.
It was. And it was probably it did set everything up. It was exciting. They didn't know how to follow it up like Terry and Brody did in Japan. Of course, Terry also said, I got the last laugh that night, though, because all those people in that arena flocked to Brody's hotel and surrounded her waiting to kill him. Well, and Brody was scared because there was thousands of people outside the hotel screaming for his head.
Well, Mr. Sullivan brought up, I should say, his interaction where he had some physicality with Terry Funk. And I'd be remiss not to bring this up because I'm going to drop in some of the famous ones that I was able to pull from YouTube, or borrow. I shouldn't say I pulled, I borrowed from YouTube of promos. So, what was it, gentlemen, that he, being Terry Funk, was able to? Yes, he was talented. He can wrestle. He can do hardcore. He can do all these different things, and he evolved from '65 until 2017 with his time in the ring, and always seemed 10 years ahead of the game. But what was it about his promo style and talking people in the building? Because obviously there's the famous, which I'm going to throw in, the motor oil one in Florida, and his promos against Cactus Jack, and just throughout his history. What was it about his talking people into the building?
That's Terry Funk. I mean, it's the difference between an Academy Award-winning actor and a high school best drama actor of the year. Terry was just so much in that, he really was in an elite class, and he knew what he was doing so well and knew how to best exploit, the situation for maximum return.
Yeah, Terry, you talk about people in the history of the business who had the greatest promos, and people will always talk about Randy Savage's promos, which, look, I'm not bashing them, they were great, but they were all pretty much the same. You never knew what you were going to get with a Terry Funk promo. Yeah. He could come out screaming like a madman, or he could come out so quiet, like he was about to break.
And doesn't that elicit a reaction, though? Oh, my gosh.
The other thing about him was you believed he was out of his fucking mind.
Well, he was out of his fucking mind, with all due respect.
Yeah. And I'm gonna say something about the other Terry here.
Okay.
And what made Terry Sullivan, and I say this, so every time he's in front of me and I say this, he blushes and thinks I'm full of shit. But I've said this on other shows.
You are,
he's not
but...
there. Yeah. Terry Sullivan is in my Mount Rushmore of wrestling announcers. There is Lance Russell, there's Gordon Solie, there's young Vince McMahon with the WWF, and I have Terry Sullivan up there with them because Terry did something different that all those other announcers did. Lance was brash and in your face and right there. Gordon Solie was just so refined and knew everything. Vince McMahon was so proper and professional with his radio voice. Terry Sullivan was us. He was the viewer. He was the common man. He was trying to get these people to talk. And my job is to get you to talk for these people. And he would do it not only with his questions, his voice, but it was his mannerisms. There is a clip, you can pull it up on YouTube, of Terry Funk in Detroit coming out and challenging Mark Lewin. And Terry Sullivan is in a cage that the commentators are in. And Terry's like, well, I got to go talk to him. And he goes up and he's holding the mic to Terry Funk, but his body is still behind the bars of the cage. Like, I'll hold the microphone out like I'm trying to feed a gorilla in the zoo, but I'm going to hide so he doesn't bite my head off. None of those other announcers or interviewers or broadcasters would have done that. It was so real, and it was so, that's how we would be reacting to. And that's why Terry Sullivan was so goddamn good at what he did.
Who are you talking about?
Yeah, some guy, he had a mustache and some funny hair back then.
I got $24 on me right now towards the bribery there, but
but he was, seriously, if you go watch it, one of the greatest interviews, not Terry Funk related at all, but one of the greatest promos and interviews in the history of the sport of professional wrestling. And yes, I call it a sport. Fuck you, everybody who yells at me for that.
Did you just say the F word?
Jew? No, he's talking about fuck. You can't say fuck in school, you fucking fat ass.
Kyle!
Is in the movie I Like to Hurt People, which is being moderated by Terry Sullivan. And Terry does so little, but so much. The way you're turning your head, the way you're trying to keep peace, but you play it off like you're terrified, but yet you're still trying to maintain order and peace. It is something none of those other broadcasters would have done it that way. They would have made them more of a focal point. You play it perfectly.
Oh my God, how could you play it any other way with those two?
That's true.
I mean, there's two of the best talkers.
Yeah, they were both.
Eddie Creechman and Ernie Roth, who at that point was Abdullah the Butcher, later the Grand Wizard.
Yeah, and folks, if you don't know that promo, look it up. That's it. I like the movie. I Like to Hurt People. It is one of the most brilliant things you will ever see in wrestling as far as promo goes. And you'll be watching that going, God damn it, why can't I get a time machine to go to that match just hearing those two talk about it?
I want to, obviously, I'll touch on the hardcore stuff too. But like I said in the introduction, because I don't want to keep everybody all night, but I mentioned Terry's time in Hollywood. And I was telling Brian before Terry joined us, I happened to watch Over the Top again today, this afternoon, which has it. Terry Funk was a bodyguard for the heel character that Stallone was going against and whatnot. But obviously, the movie I've referenced earlier with 3 different people that I have relationships with because of the show is Roadhouse.
Hey, how'd you like to tell us what the fuck's going on? You gonna help us out or not?
I'll let you know.
You know, I heard you had balls big enough to come in a dump truck, but you don't look like much to me.
So, and I think I compare Terry Funk to Jesse Ventura in terms of this. And I don't know, because I never had that conversation with Terry, but I would compare him to Jesse Ventura in terms of, let me go do some Hollywood stuff, whether it be the TV stuff or the movies, so I can get the health insurance. And you know what I mean? Thinking, because wrestling, we can have, that's a whole separate conversation. We can have the conversation on unions and whatnot. But it seemed like Terry Funk was smart. Hey, let me go do this stuff so I can be a part of the union, get the health insurance, all that fun stuff. So I think I mentioned earlier that he was always, it feels like with Terry, not only the stories you hear, but from when I dealt with him, the little bit I did, that he was 10 to 15 years ahead of the game. But he went and let me do these projects, which were cool and fun and all that stuff. But he was thinking bigger picture. Let me get the health insurance, all the other stuff with that. So I guess first question is, what was your favorite project that Terry had done?
Ooh, Terry, you go first.
Oh gosh, I was gonna you, Brian, could address the issue of him, doing a lot of Hollywood projects for his, pension and all that. But oh gosh, I don't know. Paradise Alley probably is my favorite.
Yeah, that would
1978.
be that's probably my favorite performances, and that's the one that gave him the acting bug. Paradise Alley, a bunch of wrestlers ran that. Everyone forgets it wasn't just Terry Funk. Terry was not supposed to play that role either. That was into filming when they decided to put Terry in that role. When Stallone said, this guy's better than the actor or any of the stuntmen or anybody else we have. And, he got the role, and it gave him a little bit of the acting bug because, like we were saying earlier, all those promos, all that, that's acting, folks. But you believe him. And Terry knew he could do it. And it was actually his wife. It was Vicky, the love of his life, his wife to the end, that said, you get into this union, you're going to have health insurance, you're going to have a pension. You better do this. And I don't think you had to twist Terry's arm to get in front of a camera.
And in full disclosure, I guess I should bring this up as well, because Brian brings up a good point about what Stallone had said about these guys. And I had heard a quote that people during Paradise Alley in particular, people were chuckling and laughing and whatnot about wrestling. And yeah, wrestling is what it is. I'm not going to say that. But as someone who respects the business grew up watching The Business, still watches The Business. Stallone did an awesome thing, especially at that time period in the late 70s there when Paradise Alley was filmed and made and all. He told everybody on the cast and crew, the extras, the whole gamut, in terms of, he said, I'm not going to hear anybody laugh or chuckle about what these guys are doing, because they are doing in 2 days that he had those guys, DiBiase and Funk and Murdoch, and we all know the list that was involved with that project. But Stallone said, these guys are doing in 2 days what it would take Hollywood stuntmen in 6 months to do. So we need to show them respect that they deserve.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And you had mentioned Roadhouse. Terry told me a couple stories about Roadhouse that, one of his biggest scenes is where him and the two of the other bad guys show up and they smash the bottle of liquor and they start beating up Patrick Swayze, and then Sam Elliott comes out and beats them up. Terry was not supposed to be the one that was really beating on Patrick Swayze's gut like he was. But Swayze asked the director, hey, how about we have Terry be the guy that's beating on me? And he said, because it's more believable. People will believe Terry Funk could beat me up. He says, but Swayze admitted to me later, I wanted you to do it because I knew you'd make it look good and not hurt me.
Okay. Go ahead.
But other than that fight scene when Sam Elliott came out and beat the shit out of him was not supposed to be as crazy and exaggerated as it was. It was supposed to be come out and do a couple of kicks and knock him out. And Terry's like, why don't I take a kick and fly back into that truck, into that everything on the truck, and take a huge bump? And they're like, well, we'd have to set that up and get a stuntman. And Terry's like, I do that every night. Terry's choreographing the fight as they go and made it bigger and more realistic. And if you look at the bump he takes, it's a hell of a bump. You see him jump back and fall back into the truck. That's a showman. That's a professional. He knows how to make it look good.
Let me jump in here because I joked about this story I've told over and over again. And maybe since we're talking Roadhouse, he told you this story, whether it was true or false, Brian.
That's true. But we don't know for sure because,
Terry being Terry. And
yeah.
I say this with all respect. So the story goes that I had heard that there was a rap party for the film that Joel Silver, who is a legendary producer, thrown for at the end of Roadhouse. And it was, food, beverages, the whole 9 yards, live band, the whole deal. And supposedly, the version I heard was that Terry wanted to do something with the band at the rap party. And, hey, play it in, and I can't do a good Terry Funk, but do it in the theme of Johnny Cash or this one or that, whoever it was he referenced. And they're like, yeah, okay. So the band introduces Terry because they happen to be wrestling fans. They said, hey, we got Mr. Terry Funk who was involved with the film and wants to sing with us and whatnot. And they start playing something, whatever it was. But Terry being Terry and liking to have some fun, completely changed the words and all that jazz and took it to complete left turn with it. And half the room was shocked. The other half was laughing. But as Terry would tell it, he never worked for any Joel Silver productions again.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Okay, so did he ever talk to you about this particular incident?
No, he never mentioned it, which means it's probably true and it probably pissed people off.
Like I said, it was split. Half the room did.
Well, he did tell me that he really hit it off with Sam Elliott.
Yes.
that him and Sam Elliott became fast friends after that movie, that he loved him. He thought Sam Elliott was just one of the greatest guys he'd ever met in any profession.
And I will say this, that, well, all three people, and Brian knows the three people that I have ties with the movie, being Marshall Teague, Julie Michaels, and Anthony DeLongis. And all three love Terry with their interactions with Terry. They thought he was like the rest of us, thought he was just an awesome guy, all that fun stuff. I won't say who thought what as far as the particular story I told, but you can figure it out if you go and listen to previous interviews and such. I'll put it that way. But everybody, all three loved Terry. You know, they thought the world of him because they were all on the heel side, as they would say in wrestling. But 2 out of 3 kind of confirmed the story. I'll put it that way. I won't say which two during the recording, but I'm making you go back. But could you guys see something like that with Terry? I know Brian kind of hinted at that.
Oh, Terry was a wild man, and Terry would cut promos on me to the end. He called me one night, and this was just the kind of sense of humor Terry had. And he calls me, and we're just chatting away, and he's like, "Hey, is Sarah there?" Now, Sarah's my girlfriend. She lives here. And I'm like, "Yeah, Sarah's here." And he's like, "Oh,
Poor woman.
Put her on speaker. I'd like to say hi."
Poor woman.
I'm like, "Okay." So I put the speaker on. I'm like, "Hey, Sarah, Terry wants to say." She's like, "Hi, Terry." And he goes, "Sarah, get the hell away from him. Run, get out of the house. He's crazy." That was Terry's sense of humor. I mean, I loved it. I had the same sense of humor, but I could see other people being pissed off by a joke like that. But that's Terry. He didn't care.
Terry, did you ever see that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, he's you give him something to do, and he's going to do that times 10. That's just life. That's having fun in life, And that was him. He just wanted to have a good time.
I can say I just recently talked to another podcaster out in the Northeast, and Neil Jones, and I'll put it this way, Nasty Neil. And he was fortunate enough to have Terry on a couple of times. And this is the early days in the early 2000s with, like, say, Blog Talk Radio and things like it, where things aren't as sophisticated as they are now. And they had to do things by phone, folks.
Hello.
It wasn't over Zoom and things like we're doing now. But a fan called in. They were taking fan questions and such. And thank God Terry had a fun sense of humor. Right? And he said, somebody calls in with a offhanded remark. "Hey, is it true you slept with X, Y, and Z?" Whatever. I don't want to drop any names because I don't want people going, "Hey, you're making accusations." That's not what I'm doing. But Terry, being quick with it and having a good sense of humor that he did, goes, "No, I was with this person instead that night." So it's like
Lula.
Yeah, well,
I'll tell you another one he did to Sarah. This was great. I almost forgot about this one. He called one night, and that day I had shown Sarah the Terry Funk Jack Briscoe match.
Okay, the title match, or
yeah, the title match. And I showed that match to Sarah earlier, and then Terry called that night. And we're talking to him like, "Oh, we'll put you on speakerphone because Sarah watched your match against Briscoe today, and she thought you were kind of hot."
Work with me. It's all in the head. Yeah, it's all in the hips. It's all in the hips.
Get off of me!
Hey, just easing the tension, baby.
No.
So he's like, "Okay, put her on." And I'm like, hey, Sarah, it's Terry. And Terry goes, Sarah, you're either a liar or goofy. Well, then again, you are dating that ugly son of a bitch, so you just have bad taste.
Oh, shit.
That's Terry.
Well, I know we could go ahead, Brian.
This is just how crossover Terry was and how big Terry was. My girlfriend works for the county, Erie County we live in. And in her office building one day, two people who worked there that were quite younger than her, actually. She's not an old hag, I'm not saying that, but these were probably people in their 20s. And this was about a year or so ago. And they were just talking about something, and it was Terry Funk. And he'd been retired, he'd been gone, and here's people in their 20s, and she walks by, and here's these two people talking about Terry Funk. And she stops and she says, are you talking about Terry Funk? And they're like, yeah, why? Do you know who that is? She goes, yeah, I talk to him all the time. But that's the kind of pull he had. People who weren't even alive when he was working at his peak knew who he was and will talk about him in just random situations.
And I know we could sit here all night talking terror stories and everything else.
Right on, sweet sister.
But two things I want to do here to wrap. And that being for both of you gentlemen. And I would say for what I was alive for would be either the ECW stuff or the fun they had with, or he had with Cactus or Mick in the WWE. I'm 39, and obviously I've seen everything from the Briscoe stuff on, because Brian knows I'm a history guy, and it's mind-blowing when you think about it that Terry got in when Lyndon Johnson was president and wrapped in 2017.
Yeah.
And it's mind-blowing when you think about that, because he started with guys like Superstar Graham and Harley Race and the Briscoes, and you go through the list where he saw guys like Cactus Jack and The Rock and Austin, and we can go on and on. Tommy Dreamer and what he did for ECW and stuff. But I want to do a little toast for him. But my final question for both of you is, when we say Terry Funk, because there's a lot there, both wrestling and entertainment stuff, what is your favorite memory of Terry? Both either personally or professionally.
Oh, Terry, you go first again, because I have to think about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, my favorite Terry Funk memory was the story I told about getting punched by him in the studio. Not everybody can say that.
You healed well, by the way, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a long, hard recovery. But, just the guy was an artist. And I couldn't pick out any one period of time. I mean, every time that I would see him, I knew I was in for something special. You didn't know what this guy was going to do because he was crazy. And you knew whatever it was going to be memorable. And so that's what I remember the most about him. I was a little concerned for him later in his career, and with all the really dangerous things that he was doing. But hey, that was his decision, and he hasn't second guessed it as far as I know. So let it be.
Mr. Young?
Is Terry the wrestler? God, some of those matches are so great. And people forget what a technically skilled wrestler he was, too. If you go back and watch his 2 out of 3 falls match with Harley Race, or the Briscoe matches, or some of the tag team stuff he did with Junior, you forget how gifted he was in the ring, too, and so believable. Any promo on Dusty. It's funny. I grew up in the Northeast. I'm a Buffalo kid. Mark Lewin's hometown, Buffalo, New York. But yet, to me, as a historian and a fan of everything, I don't think you could top the promos he did in Memphis with Lawler.
Why?
Do I see a sissy? Those promos, or my eye. Those promos. That's the Madman Terry Funk that I think of. Him coming out with the bandage on his eye, or coming out and slapping Lawler in the face, and I'm going to be your partner because you're a man. And, that manic, crazy Terry Funk is what I think about when I think about Terry, the wrestling performer. This, I said it at the beginning, I try not to get emotional when I'm doing shows, but it's very tough because I became so close to him. My favorite memory of Terry is actually one of the last times we spoke in depth. And I could tell it was getting towards the end. He couldn't concentrate. He would fade out as he was talking. He could be coherent, and he, knew who I was, but you could hear him fading and not understanding part of the conversations. And it's just the fact that I was able to tell him how much I loved him and how much he meant to me. And he told me, that he loved me and how much, talking to me has meant to him. And I'm just so glad we actually got to have that conversation. And that's probably my favorite memory. And that's what I'll remember most, is that one of the last conversations we had where, too many times in life, you don't get to tell someone that you love them and then they're gone. And I'm just really glad I got to tell him that. I know you're choking up too. I tried not to, but
yeah. I will put it this way. Like I said, I watched Over the Top earlier today, but I also had an opportunity because Terry mentioned about some of the stuff he did as an older competitor and stuff. And because it was easily accessible on my TV, I pulled up the WWE Network and I watched the ECW One Night Stand from 2006 when it was Dreamer and Funk versus Foley and Edge. And just as good as the match was, I also was like, excuse me for saying this, folks, but God damn, what was Terry thinking at 61 years old doing some of the stuff they did there? But no matter what the man did, he was just very entertaining. So, and he put his heart and soul into things there. So I guess I will say, as I hold this shot of Irish whiskey, and I'm not a spiritual guy or anything like that, but obviously do think there's something past the form we're in now. I just don't know what it is. But I will say, if he can hear me, or whatever the case is, and hear the three of us and everybody that's talked about him, Terry Funk, thank you for the entertainment. Thank you for the laughs when we interacted with you. Thank you for the education. Just thank you for being you. Does anybody have something to add to that?
Says it all.
The only thing I would add is, and everybody send your thoughts out to his wonderful daughters, Brandy and
Stacy. Yes.
And like I was talking to Brandy, and she says that they're so heartbroken, but they know now that the pain is gone. He's no longer suffering, and he's finally back with Vicky, the love of his life.
True, yeah.
And I will say this with that as well. And it's almost, I'm not saying they are alike, but it's similar in certain ways. And that wrestlers like Funk, Flair, Harley, all those guys, Junior, the Sheik, back in the day, were on the road so much. We have to pay our respects to, as Brian said, Stacy and Brandy, because they didn't have a relationship with their dad because they didn't have the typical 9-to-5 job because they were on the road. They traveled so much. So it was like a military lifestyle in certain ways, because they were always on the road and everything else like that to do what they did and did what they love. So the respect goes to Brandy and Stacy as well for being just as giving of their father, besides what Terry and others like him had done before. So thank you, thank you, Mr. Funk, wherever you may be.
If you're not drinking, you're out of here.
Mr.